Hello, and welcome to APTCast, APTIM's podcast that explores our teammates' passions, how those passions dovetail with our work, and how that work impacts daily life. APTIM is a leading environmental and critical infrastructure solutions firm. With more than 3,000 employees across the Americas, our dedicated people have deep experience and expertise providing integrated environmental and sustainability solutions to a wide array of government agencies, commercial, industrial, and energy customers. We're your hosts, Tim Olson and Kate Perry. We're so glad you've joined us. Right. Got a super interesting topic today, which is all about regulations surrounding refrigeration and their impact on the retail, hospitality, and food and beverage sectors. Now, before we dive in, I'm going to kick it over to Kate. You wanted to give us a short history of refrigeration.
Yes, I had the chance to do a little bit of research, and I have found some really cool things about how refrigeration began and why we're even here talking about it today. So it's actually been around since 1748. A physicist named William Cullen in Scotland was the originator of this technology. And about 150 years later, it took before people started to trust using it and businesses started to depend on it. And the original reason that it actually became something that was sought after is something that we probably all do kind of on a regular basis, maybe after a long day of work or on a Friday night. We're going to go down to our local watering hole for a beer and a burger. Seriously, the original reason that refrigeration became so wanted around the world was to be able to lager beer in the warm summer months, and then also to provide a safe supply of meat to large city centers that definitely did not want slaughterhouses in their backyards. So while the tech dates back 250 years, it's actually only been in practical use for about a century now, but it really has completely transformed the history of the way one of our most basic human functions works, which is how we feed ourselves. So author and journalist Nicola Twiley digs into the relationship between food and cold storage in her book Frostbite and in her TED Talk, How the Fridge Changed Food, which is a fascinating listen. If you've got about 15 minutes, I highly recommend that. But she talks about how essential to our modern lifestyle it has become, but at the cost that it also is causing all of us. And it's especially in the American lifestyle, it's so baked into what we do, we don't really think about it on a daily basis, but it has huge impacts on our climate. In particular, it accounts for 2.5% to 3% of all global emissions, and that's growing. And so the same system that allows us to enjoy a banana in Wisconsin or to purchase a tomato that's ripe in the middle of January is actually a major contributor to global warming. And it's at about the same levels as the global aviation industry. Think about that. So as a result, regulators have really become more hyper-focused on this more recently. We've been seeing a wave of new state and local regulations around it. There's been increasing complexity in reporting requirements. And as a result, more facilities are falling under scrutiny and are having to learn how to navigate this new complex system. And Tim is a lot smarter on that piece than I am. So I would love, Tim, for you to help break down what that looks like for us now and going forward.
If I'm a lot smarter, but the way that refrigeration regulation is being driven right now is as you said, really around decarbonization. There was bipartisan federal legislation in 2020 that directs EPA to begin phasing down hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, due to their high global warming potential. And though EPA recently put forward rules that will give company more time to respond to this phase down, the regulations are still forcing the refrigerant transition. This transition is marked towards a move towards HFC alternatives, many of which are flammable or require high pressure, driving new safety codes and training needs. EPA is not just phasing down HFC supply, it's banning certain refrigerants in specific types of equipment and focusing on life cycle control. At the same time, though, companies are increasingly facing a patchwork of state level refrigerant regulations. Several states, including California, New York, Washington, and Colorado, are going beyond the federal requirements with stricter HFC limits, leak management rules, reporting requirements, and other transition mandates. Overall, the regulation is now tightly linked to capital planning and asset lifecycle decisions, with increasing overlap between environmental regulation, safety codes, and supply chain economics. And now to introduce our guest, Kate.
So, our guest today is here to discuss the impacts of refrigeration regulation. As Tim's mentioned, our colleague Wendy Brant. Wendy is a client relationship director with APTIM who has oodles of experience managing complex enterprise wide environmental compliance programs. And she's going to share with us her journey and lessons learned. And hopefully, we'll get to know the woman behind the expert a bit as well. Hi, Wendy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Kate. Hey, Tim. It's my pleasure to be here with you today.
Wendy, before we begin our discussion, we have an initial question that we're going to be asking all our guests. And we gave it to you ahead of time, and we'd love to hear your answer to it. Question is, what does Aptim's tagline, "In pursuit of better," mean to you?
Yeah, Tim, I think for me, In Pursuit of Better really does go beyond a tagline. So I'm an environmental engineer. I've always tried to look at the system behind things. It's like how they work, how they might fail, how we can keep improving them. And even outside of work, I love to travel. So I naturally think of progress as a journey. You never really arrive at better. You're not done with that. You just keep making additional advances. So that's why Aptum feels like such a good fit for me. It's like the mindset here is similar, always pushing for better compliance, better sustainability outcomes, and better ways to protect people and the planet.
I just love the way that you compared that to travel, Wendy. I think that's such an interesting connection there. So, kind of in relation to this, refrigeration and compliance is obviously only a small part of who you are and of your journey and career. So, why don't you start with telling us a little something about you that gives us a peek into the person that came before the expert?
Thanks, Kate. Yes. Well, I started as an environmental engineer and I first worked at Superfund sites and in manufacturing plants. So, really early on, I learned to solve problems at the ground level and understand the importance there. I then went back and earned my MBA. So, I was able to move into increasingly larger and a little bit more complex environments. I landed in retail, which was a surprise to me at the time, but I was CVS Pharmacy's first employee dedicated to focusing on environmental compliance internal to the company. After CVS, I moved to Walmart and I ultimately became the vice president of global environmental health and safety there. So, between CVS and Walmart, that need to focus on building systems that scale, trying to integrate compliance into business processes, leading large teams, navigating regulatory scrutiny, all of that was pretty critical to figuring out how to work within those companies. But as you mentioned, outside of work, which is sometimes much more fun, I do love to travel. I hope to visit my 100th country soon. So, working on plans for that. But I enjoy spending time outdoors when it's not too hot. And I have a cottage up in Canada that I like to get to enjoy those beers and burgers when the timing's right, of course. Um, and I also love going to the national parks between both Canada and the US. So I think between the cottage and the national parks, that kind of led to me becoming an environmental engineer in the first place. And then, of course, since leaving Walmart, I had a chance to join Aptum part time. So it's really great to work with this company, but also have a little bit of time to do the things I like doing outside of work.
I love all of that. And before I let Tim get too deep into our main topic for today, I have to ask, what is your 100th country that you're planning to check off your list? What are you going to make as your
I
100th?
don't know yet, actually. I do not know what that will be yet. So
Well,
I'll keep you
as a
posted,
fellow
hopefully.
traveler, I absolutely love that for you. And I'm not even close to 100 countries, but I hope someday that I can be also checking off my 100th too. So that's a neat extra tidbit. Thanks, Wendy.
That's wonderful. It sounds like I need to get out of the office a little bit more. But with all your previous experience in retail, what does a strong refrigeration compliance system look like across multiple states?
Yeah, I think, Tim, a strong system needs to be built on knowledge. If you can standardize it, that's even better. So, when possible, standardization. Documentation is going to be really important. And then that verification step is also extremely important. So, to start with, you need to have clear visibility into the federal and state regulatory requirements. You need to have a single source of truth to know what you have out there. So, what assets do you have? What types of refrigerants are in use? You need to be able to track leak events, repairs, and preventative maintenance, things like that. And that's important both for your internal maintenance group, but also your third party contractors. So that can add some challenges there. Then you need to layer on training and the required certifications, the monitoring program, and of course, the change management process. So, depending on the size of your operations and the range of assets that can trigger the requirements, it can be a pretty complicated compliance program as all these recent regulatory changes that you talk about take place.
I like that phrase change management process. Can you just can we just double tap on that for a second? What does that mean to you?
It means a lot because I think it's really complicated to have a good change management process. So, not only understanding like the age of your assets and when they need to be changed just due to life cycle, as you mentioned before, knowing the regulatory changes that are coming, knowing the operational changes that can impact what type of refrigeration is required. And then, as we know, some of the newer refrigerants have different hazards and exposures associated with them. So, your environmental health and safety programs need to understand when those exposures and those hazards change. And you also may need to change other elements of the program. So, change can come from a lot of different directions, and understanding where those impacts can hit, because sometimes it's not always obvious to your business partners, is it's just really important to have a way of learning about those changes and then properly reacting to those changes.
And communicating those changes too.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you're with all of the new changes to these regulations, we're assuming that there's probably going to be some facilities that have never either come under the same regulation before or are looking at it from a different lens. Maybe this is the start of their journey into this kind of compliance as opposed to something that, like a Walmart or a CVS that had been doing it for kind of a longer period of time. So if you were giving some advice to a newer organization that's really just beginning their journey to this applicability, what would you suggest for them? How would they start out, and how would you help guide them through, what they need to remember and focus on?
Yeah, Kate, I think that's a really good point. And I would recommend starting with that fleet wide baseline. Like, you need to know what you have out there. So, what equipment, what refrigerants, what's the charge size, what's your leak history, and then, of course, the age of the equipment itself. So, that baseline is really going to help you understand what your current requirements are, understand what potential changes are coming your way, and give you that opportunity to communicate the potential future impacts to your business
Okay.
partners. Sorry, there's obviously lots of partners involved in a program as big as this. So,
It it got me thinking as you were saying, like talking about a baseline. Do you feel like peer benchmarking is a place that is helpful, especially when you're starting out, like understanding what other people are doing and being able to sort of piggyback off of past experience as opposed to, reinventing the wheel?
yeah, no, I think it's really important. And it's like there's lots of opportunities to make mistakes, and we all make mistakes, but why not learn from each other's mistakes? So, being able to network with your peers, whether it's through a trade association or companies like APTIM getting people together, I think it's really important to understand how others are interpreting the regulations themselves, understand if there's opportunities for asking for clarification or if there's regulatory reform opportunities there, but just understanding how others are being impacted to make sure that you're not missing part of those impacts in your own organizations.
Yes, you use the word interpretation, and I do feel like we heavily have to rely on others to collaborate with what does that mean for this particular scenario, setup, compliance situation. We're often left to interpret what's been given to us and figure out collectively how to approach it. I think that's important to remember.
Yeah, I agree. And by benchmarking with others, they may have an interpretation or have thought of an area of applicability that hasn't necessarily crossed our minds yet. So I think it's a very important process.
I think if nothing else, it helps people feel that they're not alone in the process. You know, it can be very isolating, I think, to sort of be presented with these large problems and having to figure out a solution that diffuses over so many different states and uh, different stores. It kind of boggles my mind a little bit. But it sounds like digital tools and sort of these interconnectivity kind of tools are very important. How do you see those kinds of tools strengthening compliance systems?
Yeah, Tim, I agree with you. I think digital tools not only create visibility and accountability, but also can keep track of that documentation that we find regulators are increasingly expecting us to have. So, things like if you can have automated leak detection, if you can have centralized refrigerant tracking, analytics are really important to give you visibility to the different timelines and thresholds that you're allowed under the regulations. So, having those digital tools will really help organizations respond as proactively as much as possible. So,
And those are really kind of more recent options and alternatives for companies anymore to be able to lean on something that's got more of that digital solution behind it. Prior to your experience, how did you manage the program then that looks differently to the way you're would manage things now with digital options?
yeah, I think there's been a set of tools available for a while, but I do think they need to be updated with the changes in regulations. So I think the original tools were used by quite a few companies that had to manage scale, as well as a lot of paperwork, of course. So the being able to move the paperwork side into the digital tools will really give us a step up when it comes to the analytics that are so important to understand which appliances are leaking and where you need to put your attention. So
So, Wendy, many sustainability teams are looking at refrigerant usage as an important part of their carbon reduction goals. How do the compliance requirements of these refrigerant regulations intersect with those initiatives?
yeah, Tim, I think that's a big one because sustainability commitments also have very aggressive timelines and they're not going to be initially aligned with those compliance requirements. So you can end up with either construction inefficiencies or duplicated work or just other aspects to that. So, and then we already mentioned how the newer technology comes with different hazards and training needs. So that also needs to be an important part of that partnership with the sustainability teams. So I think it's really critical that sustainability, operations, construction, environmental health and safety are all aligned really early and ideally before those capital decisions are even made, if possible.
Just think of the razor thin margins that grocers operate under. That they can't really afford to let maintenance inefficiencies drain budgets. That's a really great point.
And I think it's absolutely true that in all of EHS type program services, sustainability tends to be overlooked the most, I think, rather than be something that's folded into the conversation early on. It ends up being the thing that teams have to figure out how to apply afterwards. So I think the idea of keeping that at the forefront and having that partner with those conversations from the initiation is such an important reminder of how all of those systems really do work together, and compliance and operations. It's not, they're not silos. They need to work in chorus together in order for everything to be as efficient and functional as possible. What a good point.
So, Wendy, just sort of keep on this point. So what else do you feel is really important for the compliance program to be successful?
Yeah, I think it's important that compliance is embedded into those daily operations, maintenance. If it's bolted on after the fact, it's not going to be as successful. So, and I think in this particular program, it's really important because the majority of a refrigeration compliance program needs to be owned by operations, maintenance, and construction. And the EHS team or the environmental health and safety team is most likely providing support like visibility to the regulatory requirements, the expected changes, and opportunities to participate in regulatory reform efforts, like we mentioned, monitoring of the program to make sure that we're currently in compliance and to try to identify what could be an issue in the future, and then interacting with regulators as needed, whether there's an auditing program that the company wishes to have. So it's like with the EHS group providing that support, but operations, maintenance, and construction type groups tending to own the majority of it. That's why that having it embedded in daily operations is so important there. So if all those groups are working together, it'll be really kind of just how the business runs and not a compliance afterthought, if you will.
So, again, what I'm hearing is it's there's such a communications element to this, and making sure that the information flows up, back down, and then out into the field, and each one of those audiences has sort of different things that they are responsible for, but as a result, there are different things that they're listening for almost. How how do you think about communicating to those different constituencies?
Yeah, I think you're right, Tim. I think communication is really important, and that can be a challenge, especially in a large company. I think the thing that's in our favor for refrigeration is word travels pretty fast when your refrigeration is down and some of your product may be wasted. So, so like having it be such an important part of operations and something that is communicated pretty frequently around just the quality of your product and the success of your business and providing what your customers are looking for, being able to tap onto that importance is kind of what's in our favor when it comes to the compliance program around it as well.
All right. So now, Wendy, I'm going to ask you to get out your crystal ball and I want you to think about 5 years from now, 5 years down the road. What do you think operators will wish they had started doing today?
Well, not sure how well my crystal ball is working, but I would bet on, I think, data, processes, and planning are probably the three things that I would point to. So, if companies can do what they can today in those three areas, I think they'll be in pretty good shape. So, data, as I mentioned, that visibility is huge. So, if you know what you have, what refrigerants you're using, really where your exposure is, then with that baseline that we talked about, you can kind of start from the have put the right foot forward, I guess, if you will. And of course, as Tim brought up, having a robust system to store all that data is also extremely important. The second run around processes, I would spend time around the leak management side of those things. So if we look at leak detection, documentation, contractor oversight, putting time into those processes and tightening them up now, I think will put companies in a better place in the future. And then last is that capital planning. We talked about the sustainability group already. Um, of course, we all know that refrigeration transitions don't happen overnight. So if we wait for a deadline or if a refrigerant suddenly becomes unavailable, we're already behind the eight ball. So if a company sets out a good 5 to 10 year replacement strategy now, aligned with those sustainability goals, the equipment life. So again, knowing our assets, knowing the information about what our footprint looks like, and then understanding those regulatory timelines. I think that long-term capital planning will help companies be in a much better position. And really, I think it's like it's a strategic system that we're looking at for this compliance program. So companies that are treating it as such, I think will be in a better spot versus just thinking about swapping out equipment when it has to be swapped out. So
That's probably a good place to end the conversation. But as we all know, Aptim is a organization that's dedicated to continuous learning, and we're always looking for ways to foster personal and professional growth. So we have one final question we want to end with. Wendy, what are three sources of more information about refrigeration or any of the other topics, maybe communication that you'd recommend to the audience?
Yeah, Tim, I think that's a great question. I feel like I shared a lot of challenges and it could be a very overwhelming conversation to listen to, but I think there is good news out there. So, first, we mentioned the trade associations. They're invaluable for networking, sharing best practices, that collective voice for regulatory reform or clarification if it's needed. And if folks out there need help connecting, Aptum works with many companies already on this journey. I think the second one that we already talked about as well is don't reinvent the wheel. Companies like Aptum are there helping organizations understand the regulatory landscape and build those operational systems that can help work. So, learning from others' experience not only saves you time, but avoids those missteps, as I mentioned earlier. And then last, it's a good reminder to zoom out and remember the bigger picture. So there's some really good books out there. There's some great reports that highlight just how much this work matters. So whether it's climate change, whether it's communities, whether it's thinking about the future of cooling and how it gets more important over time, I think it's really good to sit back and remember the impact that we get to have in this line of work. So
That's excellent, Wendy. Thank you. And unfortunately, that is about all the time we have for today. So we want to thank you, Wendy, so much for joining us. And thank you to our listeners for joining us in the pursuit of better.
Be sure to follow Aptum on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube for our next episode, where we'll be learning about PFAS and the effects it's having on almost everything that we do. For more information about our work or to reach our guests with specific questions, please drop us an email at aptcast@aptim.com. See you next time.